Vidmori POV. The Miners Guild smelting facilities turned out to be much more intricate than I had originally imagined. At first, I thought it would be some kind of warehouse, filled with a variety of crucibles for melting ore in many small batches. What I was not expecting was a full-on 2-story foundry complex that spanned around 4 city blocks. I felt almost like some kind of VIP being escorted around the foundry by Tilsim and some of his staff, as they showed me around the place while guiding me to the station where I'd be working. From what I could tell, it was a rather odd mix of what appeared to be rather modern techniques and practices, with frankly archaic equipment. There were clearly painted lines all over the place, marking safe pathways and danger zones. Not to mention multiple sandpit stations and even specialized water runes with some kind of mana batteries with piping leading to key points around each section of the foundry that created what appeared to be some kind of fire suppression system. Despite that, most of the machinery appeared to be man-powered, either by large levers and cranks connected to a simple array of large gears to move heavy loads from one level of the foundry to another, or by these hamster wheel contraptions big enough for 2 men to run on, and power what looked to be some kind of conveyor belt that moves processed metals to another end of the foundry. At this time of day, the foundry's main floor has ceased production and has long since closed up for the day, with only a few members of staff going from station to station performing some kind of daily cleaning or maintenance. Coming up to the station where I would be working, I was greeted by a team of 15 workers, who were all dressed up in surprisingly thorough amounts of PPE. Even the beastkin, who I've noticed don't normally wear shoes, were wearing some kind of thick wrappings that covered their various unique styles of feet. All of them were wearing tinted goggles, and an assortment of face wrappings and shields that seemed both mass-produced and specifically made for their various facial structures. Tilsim took the initiative, as he stepped forward and gestured at me, introducing me to the team before me. "This is Vito, an exceedingly powerful fire mage who is coming in to help work through the backlog of Wolfram orders we've been unable to complete these last few weeks. He's only in town until tomorrow morning, so we must do our best to complete as much as possible before he has to go." The team murmured their greetings, though I could sense an overwhelming amount of uncertainty and doubt coming from the lot of them. It didn't take long before a dogkin man piped up, stepping forward from the group. "How are you so certain he's the real deal? This isn't going to be like those other mages you've hired who quit before we got started because they couldn't handle the work, right?" he asked, turning his head to look from Tilsim and then to me. Despite the tinted goggles, I could feel his eyes scrutinizing me, as if he didn't like what he saw. He then looked at Tilsim once more. "How much is he charging you for this work anyway?" Tilsim merely frowned at the insult against my ability and honor, though I could feel him understand where his workers were coming from, as he merely shook his head. "I asked him for his help, not the other way around. Besides, as for his pay, He went quiet after a moment, when he suddenly had a realization, glancing up at me, as he ran his fingers through his beard before chuckling a little, sheepishly. "Now that I think about it, I don't believe we actually discussed the pay for your efforts today." I merely smiled a bit before looking at Tilsim. "Don't worry about it. Consider my payment the favor I asked of you," I suggest, before looking at the workers. "With that said, I'll do my best to maintain the crucible's heat and stay out of yours way. My only experience in this place is fire, after all, so I'll keep my focus where it belongs." Now that does get the mood to shift a little bit, as the workers look at each other, seemingly appeased by the fact that I wasn't a smug know-it-all, or something along those lines. That's when Tilsim clapped his hands together, flashing a wide grin. "And remember, you all are getting 1.5 times pay tonight, along with overtime if Vito is able to handle it. We're only getting this one chance to get back on top of things, so do your best," he explained, as encouragingly as he could. The workers cheering in response before Tilsum clapped his hands together a few times, doing his best to get their attention again. With all that said, make sure to take breaks and play things safe. Nobody is going to praise you for pushing yourself past your limits and getting yourself and others in dangerous situations. Now then, to your stations. With that, the 14 workers dispersed, pairing off, and going to each station as they began going through the motions of their work. Though the 15th lingered nearby, it was a young man as far as I could tell due to their PPE, but not a beastskin. Tilsum then signaled for me to follow, as he led me to a set of stairs that went up to the second level. Now at the top, Tilsum approached a console of some kind with a few different panels, and even some temperature gauges, along with a few other meters, gesturing to it as he looked at me. "This will be your station, Vito. Just run your mana through these 2 panels," he said, as he gestured to 2 red panels with handprints woven into the surface. "From there, you will be able to heat the crucible and control the temperature without having to waste mana running your magic through open air, or needing to make direct contact with the crucible itself. Keep in mind that this is not a matter of strength, but endurance. You'll of course be given breaks every 2 hours or as you need it. However, if you need anything between your breaks, just ask him," Tilsum says, as he gestures to the young man who stayed by my side. "His job is to support and watch over the Crucible Master. In short, he is your assistant. If you need anything from water to a mana potion, just ask, and he'll fetch it for you." The young man in question just gave a small wave, before speaking up with a rather muffled voice. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Vito. I look forward to working with you," he said politely enough. Tilsum gives a little nod of approval before looking at me again. "Now then, do you happen to know your measurements? We should get you some protective equipment before we get started." I just shrugged before flashing a smile. "I don't, but don't worry about it. My mentor always told me that I'm like a dragon around fire, so it shouldn't affect me much, though I like to test my resistance against prolonged exposure to intense heat, among other things," I explained vaguely, as I went about shrugging off my cloak. Tilsum looked admittedly unsure of my claims, and I could sense he wasn't sure what to address in particular, when he was suddenly startled as he finally noticed my missing limb. "But, Vito, your arm! What's happened?" he asked, stepping closer as he looked over the limp left sleeve of my green shirt. I made a show of acting as if I didn't realize what he was talking about at first, glancing at my missing limb, before a look of realization came over my face. "Ah, that's right. Don't worry, it's just a prosthetic. See?" I mused as I took off my shirt, stashing that away before showing him the stump of my left arm. By this point, around half of my upper arm had grown back, so it'll likely take a couple of days for the whole arm to fully grow back on its own, if I consider how long it took me to grow half a forearm and a hand. As for the stump itself, the illusion was covering the part of the arm that had grown back, but as for the part that was still growing, it seemed like the illusion magic wasn't sure what to make of it, so the wood was exposed for everyone else to see. That seemed to calm Tilsum for a moment, before he looked even more bewildered as another question came to mind. "Even if it is a prosthetic, what happened to the prosthetic? I could have sworn you had both arms last night," he asked, as he looked me in the eye. I just chuckled a little bit at his question, before scratching the back of my head. I turned it into a staff and gave it to a young mage who did me a favor." Tilsum wasn't sure what to say to that, just flabbergasted by the sudden revelation, before sighing as he looked me over. While he took his time trying to find his words, I could sense he was at least vaguely impressed with the array of scars that littered my body, though his eyes lingered on the old burn scars that ran across my right shoulder. "I thought you said you were resistant to fire. What are those?" he asked, as he pointed them out. I glanced over to my shoulder before smiling a little more. "Well, they're burn scars, of course. I wasn't always as resistant to fire as I am now," I mused kindly, before regarding my shoulder again. "They serve as a very important lesson to a younger me, about the power and might a simple flame holds. Toism just sighed softly, before shaking his head a little, deciding to not argue all that much as he smiled a little. Anyways, I'll leave you to it then. If you feel you eventually need some protective equipment, then just ask. With that, he dismissed himself, making his way down the stairs. I simply bobbed my head before looking at my assistant as I approached the console while placing my hand against a panel. Now then, shall we get to work? Chris POV. Today has been a day unlike any other. It started out so normal at first, waking up before dawn and making sure his sister's medicines were in order, making breakfast, and eating with her before meeting up with his team. They snuck into the inner city using one of their usual routes, and took their usual post outside the pawn shop. But now, their contact within the pawn shop was dead, and they were being hired by Vito, the man who casually made another grown man vanish into thin air. On the other hand, they stole everything of value from the Goatkin man's home, and found over 60 gold pieces worth of silver and gold in a floor safe, underneath a bag of beans in a pantry. The amount of coin in that safe was staggering, as that much could change any of their lives, allowing them to live extravagantly for a week, or very comfortably and modestly for several years without working. It did make Chris wonder just how long that Goatkin had been stealing from his boss, or how many other thieves he's worked with, because as far as Chris was concerned, his team hadn't given the Goatkin anywhere close to 60 gold pieces since they began working together. Ultimately, Zax took the dragon's share of the coin in order to clear his family's debts with a bank of time. The look on Zax's face when Chris placed the pouch of coin in their hand was of tearful relief. The half-orc was ultimately unable to remain stoic, as he was finally going to be free from the looming debts that came around due to the untimely death of his parents, and according to Zax, his parents' souls could now properly rest, knowing they are no longer troubling their son beyond the grave. Surprisingly enough, the Bank of Time didn't care to ask how or where Zax got his sudden windfall. All they cared about was getting the coin they were owed. With that business done, and Zax freed of his debt, the trio split the remaining coin evenly amongst each other, before splitting up for the day. According to Vito, they'll all be heading for the capital first thing in the morning, and such a trip requires preparation. Thankfully, Vito said they could use the coin that was left after paying Zax's debts how they saw fit, as long as they gave him whatever was left over. Even as the others left to immediately begin their preparation, Chris couldn't bring himself to get started, without going home first. After all, this decision won't only affect him, and if she doesn't want him to go, well, he'll have to figure something else out. He always has in one way or another. He made his way home soon enough, arriving at the apartment complex in the Outer Ring that has been his home for the last 5 years. Making his way past a few of the other residents, he made his way up to the second floor before procuring his key as he made his way inside. Opening and shutting the door behind him, he could hear somewhat frantic shuffling coming from the living room as his sister called out, "Welcome home, Chris," she says, in a rather distracted fashion. With his curiosity piqued, and worries momentarily set aside, he stepped further into the apartment, looking around the little living room as he spotted his sister, the 12-year-old girl, frantically yet carefully stashing away what looked to be some planks of wood underneath the cushion of their couch. The coffee table, which usually doubles as her study area, was still covered in paperwork that looked to be some kind of homework or something. He wasn't too sure. "Ren, what are you doing?" he asked, not exactly sure what to make of the scene that was playing out in front of him. She meeped nervously, her fluffy, burnt orange and black tail swishing nervously behind her, before she slowly turned to look up at him, flashing a little smile as she scratched her cheek. Her pale skin was covered in black smudges that were littered around her hands and arms. "Nothing," she said, slowly dragging out the word as her volping ears waggled. "Uh-huh. So there's nothing to see under that particular couch cushion you're hovering over, right?" he asked, flashing a small smile as he shrugged off his cloak and hung it by the door. "That's right," she said more confidently, before slowly shifting around to sit on the couch, doing her best to further conceal whatever she was hiding. "Anyways, you're home early. Like, really early. Did something happen? Are you in trouble?" she asked, narrowing her gaze as she did her best to change the subject. Now it was his turn to stall a little bit, his tail curling close behind him as he went over to the kitchenette, grabbing a fruit before polishing it on his shirt. "Well, I'm not in trouble, I don't think," he admitted, before taking a bite of the fruit. "So something happened?" she asked, quick to grab onto that detail, as she watched him intently from where she sat. He leaned back against the counter, stalling as he took his time savouring the bite he was working on, before eventually responding. I got a new job," he said, not sure how else to say it when he took another bite. She tilted her head curiously at him, her right ear flicking in thought. "Like a job? Or is it a job?" Of course, she knew he was a criminal of some kind, but he didn't usually share, and she never really pried. Chris just shrugged, now scratching the back of his head with his free hand, as he stared at the fruit before glancing over to Ren, gazing into her eyes from where he stood. "I don't actually know," he said, unsure of how to describe it since Vito didn't exactly give them too much on the details, and he was too scared to really ask. "So, what's the problem? Or what's the catch?" she asked, leaning into the arm of the couch now, as she watched him. "Is it because of me? Do we need more money for something? Did the healer say something to you?" She continued to ask, her mind running away with possible issues that came to mind, as her brows started to furrow with worry. He set the fruit down on the counter, walking across the room to gently pat her head to get her to stop her rambling. She went quiet at his touch, looking up at him as their eyes met. It wasn't hard for him to see the anxiety in her eyes. "It's not your fault, and it's not because of you. Well, what I do tomorrow morning will affect both of us, and I want your opinion, since this is now a family matter." She nodded, seemingly coming down for the moment before pulling away as she stood. "Give me a second," she said simply, before hurrying off and going into her room. It was the only other room aside from the bathroom in this apartment, as he usually slept on the couch. He watched her go, though he glanced at the couch curiously, wondering what she was hiding from him. Ultimately, he left it alone. She was entitled to some secrets after all. While he waited, he walked back into the kitchenette and collected his fruit, taking another bite from it. He could hear things being scooted around in her room, which he didn't think much of until he heard the sound of a lot of coins shifting around in a pouch. Ren came back soon enough, carrying a weighty pouch that jangled with every step. "Here, if we need money, I'm more than ready to contribute where I can," she said resolutely, as she held up the pouch. Chris's eyes went wide, not sure what to make of this, as he glanced between her and the pouch. Setting down his fruit again and taking up the pouch, he peered inside to see a lot of copper pieces, and even a few silver here and there. Where'd you get all this? Are those silvers?" She flashed an almost mischievous smile, her tail swaying behind her, as she stood as tall as she could manage. "There are 76 copper pieces and 3 silver pieces in there," she mentioned, while looking a little smug. "I've been working too, you know. For the last couple of months, I've been writing letters and documents for our neighbours, and they've been paying me for my help." Chris wasn't sure what to say, looking between her and the pouch again. Wow, all this just from writing words on parchment? He couldn't help but be impressed. He had to put himself on the line every time he went out to bring home coins so she could be comfortable. Yet she found a way to make money without the risk all on her own. She hummed in confirmation, before making her way to the couch and pulling out the planks she had hidden. They appeared to be some kind of placards, advertising a new deal at a food cart. Mr. Ray even commissioned me to draw out some advertisements for him. He's going to pay me a silver for each of them. I've been working on them all day and I'm nearly done. The placards in question looked really well done, with very neat and big writing, accompanied by illustrations of a few different types of food, along with a smiley face here and there. A silver for each, and she had 4 of them just about ready to go. In just one day, she was about to make double what he was able to bring home after half a day of freelance fishing. Tears began welling up in his eyes as he turned away, bringing his hand to his face as he couldn't help but feel pride at how much Ren had matured, while also despairing at how she felt that she had to step up to help their situation. Ren still hadn't noticed the state Chris was in, looking over one of her placards as her ears waggled with delight. Miss Eliza says if I refine my penmanship more, she can probably introduce me to some merchants or a guild in a year or 2, then maybe I can work as a scribe or some kind of receptionist, she enthused, as she finally looked up to Chris with a smile. Isn't that great? Though her smile wilted a little, as she noticed the expression on his face. Chris, is something wrong? Chris did his best to suppress his emotions. At the very least, he tried not to break down in front of her. He sighed softly after a moment longer, a shuddering breath escaping his lips as he wiped at his eyes, before anything could show. Nothing is wrong. I just can't help but think how amazing you are, he said, as he offered a smile before draping his arms around her and pulling her into a deep hug. She was still so small, especially for her age. He still couldn't help but see her as the frail little girl who was sick every other week. She was better now, but nowhere near where she should be or anywhere like the other kids. Ren was a little surprised by the hug, but managed to wrangle one arm free and returned the hug with as much vigor as she could manage, her tail swaying with delight behind her. I know, I am pretty amazing, aren't I? She amused, preening a little under the praise. He pulled away from the hug soon enough, wiping his eyes again as he stepped away from the kitchenette, while looking over the placards again. So, like I said, I got this job, he mentioned, while moving to the living room, as he sat on the floor by the coffee table. Ren followed, sitting across from him as she set the other placards down on the table before taking up a small bottle of black ink and a brush. An important decision that will affect the family, right? She asked, reiterating what he mentioned earlier, as she went about adding the final details to the 4th placard she had been working on before he came home. Yeah, as far as I can tell, it's going to be a long-term job, and I likely won't be back for several weeks, if not months, he explained, running his hands through his hair before scratching the back of his head. Ren's eyes went a little wide with surprise, though she slowly nodded intently. Wow, that's a very long time, she said softly, as she watched him closely. How much are you going to be paid? Chris shrugged a bit. He wasn't sure of that either. I don't know, he admitted rather sheepishly. Ren quirked a brow at that, her left ear waggling with uncertainty. So you don't know anything about the job, how long you're going to be gone, or how much you are going to be paid. What do you know? Chris huffed a bit, knowing how bad it sounded before looking over and meeting her eyes. If I work for him, he said he'll heal your body. Don't ask me how, but I believe he can actually do it. Oh, was all she could say to that. Yeah, so I don't really care what I have to do. If I can give you a future without having to worry about your health, I'll do it. No questions asked, he said, resolving himself already, as he stared into the middle distance while looking at the table. Ren was silent for a time, not saying a word before standing, as she walked around and draped her arms around Chris, hugging him from behind while resting her chin atop his head.
You do so much for me already. I couldn't possibly ask you to do more.
Chris just sighed a bit, before offering a smile as he accepted her embrace. What else are big brothers for? Anyways, what do you think? Like I said, this is a family decision, and this is affecting you the most.
Well, where are you going?
She asked, as her tail slowly swayed behind her. The capital, I think. I don't know if it's our only destination, but that's what I've been told, he mentioned with a small smile. There was the only other upside to this job. He lived his whole life in this frontier town, and had no real reason to leave before today, and now he was going to the capital.
Wow, really?
She exclaimed, pulling away to sit beside him now. She then hummed thoughtfully, tilting her head side to side as her ears waggled some more.
Well, if I'm going to get better anyway, think I can come along? We should stick together at the end of the day, and there's no safer place for me than by your side.
Chris wasn't sure what to say to that, his own ears flicking thoughtfully. I don't actually know, he considered, before looking over at her and smiling a bit more. But I'll certainly ask. For now, how about we do some shopping? I'll make something extra special for dinner, he said as he stood, holding his hand out to her. At that, Ren just smiled with delight, taking up his hand as she got to her feet.
Sounds good to me,